I can't decide. We can't decide if we should stand up or not.
It's a big discussion.
No.
Alan is shaking her head no.
No.
Okay. Thank you again for the introduction, gracious generation, and thank you to everyone for being here. We certainly appreciate you coming to our talk. We've titled our talk Learning Windows, Using Reflective Writing to Remote Learning Transfer. Adrian is developing the metaphor of reflection as a learning window in the way that reflection has the potential capacity to give us a window onto what students are learning in a different way than assignments or even other sorts of research modalities. And so we'd like to talk a little bit about writing reflection and reflective writing and how we're using it in the composition program in the English department. We've been experimenting with reflection and reflective writing in the composition program in our department for probably since around 2010, 2011 in all of our general education courses. And we've been trying to get a handle on what's going well, what's not going well, what could be doing better, and trying to connect that to other research on reflection and related concepts of metacognition and transfer through several disciplines. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the experiments and some of the research that we've done so far in working with reflective writing in our program. So there are four of us. After a brief introduction here, Adrian is going to take over and talk a little bit about affect in student reflective writing. And then I'm going to talk for a little bit about the grammatical features of student reflection. One of the issues that Adrian and I have been interested in is when we talk about students reflective writing, what are we actually talking about? What does it look like? And so I'll talk about some grammatical features. And then Jewel, who's been using reflection in our intermediate writing course, English 3010, is going to talk about the use of reflection in a genre-based pedagogy and the use of reflective writing in the promotion of genre awareness in our sequence. And then Clay is going to wrap up and talk a little bit more about the use of reflection in our intermediate course and the degree to which reflective writing can promote student agency as writers and learners. So that'll be an overview of what we'll do over the next hour or so. Before we do that, we should just talk about some sort of basic definitions. I'm not going to read these to you, but I'll let them read them to yourself. These two definitions of reflection and reflective writing come from Jennifer Moon and her book on reflective and experiential learning that came out in 2004. It's a fairly generic definition for both of these things, but this will maybe just lay the groundwork for some of what we'll be talking about. So I'll give you just a second to read those two definitions. So one distinction here that is important has to do with this concept of intentionality for reflection. So for instance, after this presentation, as we walk back to the department, it would not be uncommon or unusual for both you as attendees and us as presenters to sort of think, hey, how did that go? And you just kind of like internally go, oh, I think that went pretty well. So there's a way of thinking like, oh, that's reflection. But within this definition, within Moon's definition, reflection, and then by extension reflective writing, has to do with intentionality. It is, why are you using this thought process? So the way that she's talking about it is reflection has to be used to achieve some other goal. So whether it's to capture learning or to reveal further avenues for learning or areas of misunderstanding or, for instance, clarification or to plan for some course of action. So we all reflect all the time in a sort of more generic sense where we just kind of think, hey, how are things going? It's nice outside. You say, is that reflection? Well, yes, it is reflection, but in this specific definition that we're talking about it, the concept that's built into it is this sense of intentionality, that you're using reflection to accomplish some other goal. And this is one problem with the way that we sometimes use reflection in the classroom, is that oftentimes we ask students to reflect, but we never really explain why they're reflecting. sometimes we'll say, oh, well, it's just a good thing to do. It's like, which is not exactly what we are looking for. What we want to do is be very clear with students about why are we asking them to reflect? What is the goal of reflection? What is it we hope that they accomplish? So that's where these definitions and this concept of intentionality becomes important.
So when we employ reflection as a tool for learning, for students to learn and for us to learn about student learning in the classroom, we practice specifically prompting students, well, typically to recall and articulate their writing processes. Sometimes they're reflecting after the fact, sometimes they reflect as they're working through a process, and sometimes, although reflection, we tend to think of that as looking back, sometimes we can ask students to kind of predict through reflection as well. That specific prompting and articulation is key for students to understand their processes, to develop a sense of agency about their writing, that they are active decision makers in the process of writing, and also for the development of their metacognition about writing, their ability to write about the writing process and to develop theories about writing based on their experiences. Their ability to construct meta-knowledge about the writing process is, and we ask them to construct that often through reflection, through written reflection, not just through thinking in their brains. But that allows them to better take and then recontextualize their knowledge about writing when they enter new writing situations. That's when what scholars sometimes call positive transfer occurs, when they can properly recontextualize that writing knowledge in a new situation. So we'll talk a little bit about a study that Thomas and I recently completed first. We conducted a study of 106 end of semester reflective essays from the fall of 2013. And our major question as we were conducting this research was, like Thomas mentioned earlier, what does reflection look like in student essays? This question came to us after several semesters of participating in assessment and having a recurring conversation with other instructors about where, when we look in students' reflections, where is what we think is reflection actually happening? And so we wanted to uncover those features and figure out what we meant when we were talking about the reflective moments in the text. So we did a text analysis of 106 end of semester reflective essays. We used a taxonomy that lays out, we don't have that taxonomy in here. Do we have it in here? No. We'll get to a few of the terms later, but we used a taxonomy that laid out moves like monitoring, regulation and control, evaluation, different metacognitive moves that students could be using in their reflection. And so we looked for those, we coded the passages, and then from there we worked to find significant patterns in the data. And after working through that process, Thomas and I, like you mentioned earlier, each focused on different parts of the text that we thought were particularly interesting, so that we could go back to help think about how we could use this for developing instruction in reflection and in thinking about how to better work with reflection with our students. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about a part that interested me when we were going through our initial process. I kept tuning into where students had expressed moments of feelings or emotions, and while there's a lot more to affect, I'm going to throw that term in here occasionally as well. So I felt, as we went through the excerpts, that there were places where students expressed something that gave me access to a moment in their process that I didn't get otherwise. I didn't necessarily get that access when I was talking with them in class or from their other work that they had submitted. But when I read these moments in their reflective essays, there was like a little, if it's a window, it was like the curtain was just slightly parted so I could begin to see something really important. So I wanted to pay attention to what I could learn by looking at those moments in student texts. And I was thinking about how if the reflective argument essay that we were using as an end of semester instrument in our English 1020 class was an instrument that we use both for looking at students' progress and our instruction, then that looking at these affective moments might help me see some moments that were formative in students' learning or that were left untapped, like they needed more attention. So I went back through and coded our set of data and developed and applied the codes that I have up there. Found 102 instances of emotional or affective words and phrases, and applied these degree of confidence codes were the highest. That makes sense for a writing exercise where students are asked to talk about how well they accomplished course learning outcomes. So there were several places where students would write things like, with the help of the first thing I learned in this class, the process of genre analysis, I'm confident that I can read and write in almost any unfamiliar genre and be able to turn it around into my own work. They wanted to show that they could do something very well. Degree of difficulty was the next most, it wasn't the next one, inspiration and understanding, but degree of difficulty also stood out significantly to me, where students are writing about struggling with comprehending or navigating a task. And those were the ones that were especially interesting to me. Words like struggled came up so much in those discussions, and those are the places where I wanted to understand, like, so did you struggle and never overcome the learning problem that you were having? Did you struggle with something and then kind of figure out a way to work around the issue, or is there something else that I need to be doing as a teacher? Other places that seemed important where they talked about how their feelings changed, and a lot of times this happens in the introduction of an essay, and that's partly a rhetorical move to be like, dear teacher, now I know everything there is to know about writing, thank you so much. But there are other places too where they're keying into a specific thing that happened in class that helped them feel differently about the writing process. Or they also showed sometimes how invested they were, or talked about a moment of learning that helped them really understand the process. So these kinds of moments often say things like, I once was lost, but now I'm found. This course made all the difference. I learned what I was supposed to, because as an evaluation of their learning, and sometimes students will use it as an evaluation of the course, those are moves that they see to be important. But I think that these moments could give us so much more as we're working to learn about students' writing and about our instruction in a course like English 1020. They're just hints at what more is happening beneath the surface. And what I wanted to think about was how better to engage with students' reflections, to begin digging at these moments and find out what was happening in the process. So I started to think about a way that throughout students' reflective writing process across the semester, because we don't just have students reflect at the end, we have them constantly reflecting as they go through the semester. How could we provide feedback on students' reflections and offer them the chance to revise or explain or clarify what they're writing about in those reflections? We give students feedback on other kinds of writing, but often we kind of use reflection as just their statement that we don't come back to. And so I want to think about how we could use those. So I worked on developing this heuristic based on the taxonomy that we use. This is just an excerpt of it. Not all of the elements of it are up here, but I pulled out a few that I thought were interesting. So on the left-hand side are the metacognitive behaviors, or some of the metacognitive behaviors, and on the right-hand side are questions that I would pose to students in response to their reflections. When I see a moment where that emotion is starting to come out, what do I think it could be happening or should be happening? Is it a moment where a student's about to evaluate their progress on a course learning outcome or on a project? Is it a moment where they're writing about the process, monitoring what's happening, but they're not really getting into it? And so These questions on the right-hand side are questions that I would ask students to take a moment and then write more about what's happening in that space. And so I used this exercise last semester with my English 1020 students to have them go back, after I had read their reflections, to go back and add more concrete details and explanations into their writing. These kinds of questions, I think, prompt students to develop more of the what of the rhetorical situation, how, explaining their writing process, explaining why they're feeling things about their experience in the writing class, and to think and talk and write about writing goals, strategies, obstacles, successes, and to move from developing details into developing an analysis of the emotions that they're having in response to their writing experiences. Recently, I shared this heuristic with a group of instructors, and I was asked if I thought that teachers needed to be familiar with the taxonomy and use that taxonomy as part of the vocabulary of their classroom for this to be successful. And reflecting on that question now, I don't think so. I think the questions in the heuristic do the defining, and then doing the thinking about those questions is more important than knowing or adopting the terms themselves. Though for us, for our purposes in trying to answer our research question, what does students' reflective writing look like? What are the features of students' reflective writing? Then having the shared vocabulary for discussing what's happening in students' reflections is really important. Overall, what I think a heuristic like this can do, and this paired with teachers giving feedback on student writing and using that reflective writing as part of the conversation instead of the end of a thread of conversation, is to help students develop what Jarrett et al. And other scholars want, stronger pedagogical memory is the phrase they use for what's happening in their writing, and to help them articulate key moments in their processes that they can draw from in future writing situations. So this is a feedback strategy that I continue to use and think about as I'm working with students' reflections.
So Adrian mentioned that in our research project we looked at students' end of semester reflective essays. Adrian became interested in the role of affect and emotion in student reflection. I became interested in grammatical features of students' reflections. And the first thing I became interested in was actual sentence subjects, the grammatical subjects in the head-noun position in students' reflective writing. So you can see at the bottom of the table, I coded 2,249 sentences, and then came up with sentence subject codes. So just as an example of the head-noun position, so one of the things we noticed was the first person I. So just as an example, the example, I learned a lot in this class. So the subject is I, first person I. Well, so in our excerpts, what I noticed is that 50% of sentence subjects in students' reflective writing is the first person I. So what I'm interested in is the way that this particular sentence structure, grammatical structure, limits what a student can say, and also opens certain opportunities for what students can say when they reflect. So you can see, you can take a look at some of the other codes for sentence subjects that students did talk about. So the next largest category, only 16%, is other. So this is miscellaneous. So if a student had a sentence in their reflection that said, cars go really fast, that's other. Cars was an uncommon sentence subject, but still those others, kind of miscellaneous, uncodable nouns, was the next largest category. The next most common sentence subjects represent the balance of the table. So student writing, maybe reference to a specific assignment, my research paper, a specific skill, research, or a learning outcome. Our course, first year writing, English 1020, has 4 learning outcomes: reading, writing, research, and reflection. So for instance, my other example, reading was an important skill. Reading is a course learning outcome, but still that only represented 6% of all sentence subjects in the corpus. If you add up the percentage totals in my right-hand column, you'll quickly notice that doesn't add up to 100. There's other miscellaneous sentence subject categories that they had very low frequencies, but I didn't put on the table just because it wouldn't fit on the screen. So those are the most common ones. 50% were I. Okay, so this isn't surprising. Ellen.
Could you give me an example of student writing as a sentence subject? The category was 7%.
Yes. The writing I did in this course
Okay. Thank you.
was difficult.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Got it.
Okay. So Jennifer Moon, who I cited earlier for her definitions of reflection, says that for all of us, and student writers in particular, the default mode in reflection is simple description. I did this. I learned this. But her argument is that this is sort of the lowest level of depth in terms of the kinds of reflection that we actually are looking for students to do if we want to foster metacognitive behaviors and learning transfer from one learning context to the next. So students can say interesting things in the sentence structure, I did X. But that if they always use this, as this is the most predominant sentence subject, that this paints them into a kind of corner with what they can do conceptually with reflection. The other thing that I'll notice that I didn't create a slide for is like 53% of all subject verbs were in the past tense. So my second example, well, for both examples, I learned a lot. So 53% of verbs were in the past tense. Here's something that I did. Not here's something I will do or something that I do all the time, something that I did in the past. So one thing that I'd like to do, and I think that we should spend some time working on, is how do we get students off of writing reflective sentences with I in the head noun position to open up other kinds of thinking and other kinds of positioning they could do that could foster different kinds of behaviors and foster learning transfer, because I think that's what we really want. So I went back to a piece that was written by Scarnamalia and others in 1984. Scarnamalia was experimenting with what he calls sentence stems, or generative stems. And what he would do, he was trying to foster critical thinking in his courses. So what he would have students do is he would have students write, whether it was research or summary, but then Scarnamalia would have a stack of 3x5 cards with different sentence stems, sentences with other subjects, other than the first person I, and he would randomly distribute these 3x5 cards and make students rewrite sentences using these other subjects. So instead of using I, something else would take the place of I. His thinking is that this would open the door to other kinds of thinking processes. So what I thought about doing was trying to use this approach to suggest other ways that students could reflectively write to get them away from using the first person I to open the door to other sorts of things. So in the paper that, in the draft of the paper that Adrian and I wrote, I came up with a table that compared student text, these are actual sentences from sentences in our corpus, and then some ways that we might provide students with different generative stems to get them to sort of shift their thinking and to reflect in a slightly different way. So for instance, on the left-hand side in the first cell, it says, in past persuasive or argumentative writing of mine, I had been using rhetorical devices without knowing it, which is a fine thing to say. What I'm interested in doing is then giving the student a different stem, a different sentence subject. Get them to think about what they said, but to spin it in a different way. So for instance, my writing stem might be writing for this class in a more sort of general way. Required me to, and then the student would have to finish this sentence. With the idea being this would then open up a different vista for them to experiment with reflection. So I'll skip down to the third row. So the student example, so this is an actual example from our corpus. Rather than only using the required minimum of four sources, I explored 2 additional sources that gave me insight. So again, this is a solid sentence, the students reflecting on their research process. But then what I'd like to do is suggest, well, let's give students a different sentence subject that builds on this and ask them to finish that sentence and hopefully extend that. So a possible stem might be, well, an important element of the research process that I'll need to remember, so they're still in the sentence, they're still in the picture, is X. So now they don't have to say, oh, you asked me to look for 2 sources, but then I really looked for 4 sources, which is a fine thing to say. Well, okay, let's try and generalize now about the research process more generally. What are you going to do in the future? What do you now know about research that you didn't know before? Yes, I know you found 4 sources, but what can you say more generally about research? So that would be the idea of these stems, okay? Pedagogically, where you could take this as a teaching strategy is hopefully students could then start to develop their own stems that they could either share with each other, or they could build their own generative stems that they could use to sort of to augment their own writing and to explore. But the goal here again is to get them away from the most common sentence subject, I, to thinking about other subjects. So there's also a strand of literature that suggests that just this nominalization, this looking for other nouns as processes, is a way of critical thinking and being able to connect thinking to other knowledge domains that, again, would not be the default for our first-year students. So that move to the first person is completely natural and can be productive. I think what I'm trying to argue is that we need to get them considering other things, and that these generative stems might be a way to do that. So I haven't tried this out yet. But this is what has to happen next. All right, I'm handing off.
Hello.
Julia?
Thanks. All right, so I conducted research on my English 3010 course in the summer of 2015. To give you a really quick overview, my focus in my course is on metadisciplines and metagenres. Metadisciplines being a way to highlight broad patterns of disciplinary ways of knowing and doing and writing, and a way to share emphasis on certain metagenres. And metagenres, according to Carter, are broader patterns of language as social action, or similar kinds of typified responses that are related to recurrent situations. And so therefore my pedagogy is very highly genre-based, utilizing writing in and writing across the curriculum. And our course objectives are to rewrite, research, and reflect, and so therefore reflection is a large component of this course, and in fact is incorporated throughout the entire semester. So I collected data. My first data set was research proposals. They were a mini reflection. They were midpoint in their research proposal, so this is their kind of final big research paper in which they're utilizing all the genre knowledge that they've gained throughout the semester. And so they're asked to read particular academic articles in their field, research those articles, and they're asked to write out that research proposal in a disciplinary format of the metagenre that we have for the course, and reflect throughout the way. So this reflection happened midpoint after they had become intimately involved with their research and began writing the literature review, but still had a fair way to go. Data set 2 that I looked at was their final reflective portfolio, a required component for our 1010, 1020, and 3010 courses. And the objectives were to have students talk about what they did know, what they wanted to know, what they learned, and what changed about their writing. And I used this, and I looked only at their introduction and then their description of Project 3, so that I could compare the changes between their mini reflection regarding Project 3 and what in fact did or did not change. And so my research question for this was, do students reflect genre awareness in the reflective essays? And do students show evidence of a growing development of genre awareness between their research proposal mini reflections to their final reflective portfolios? I had a very small class that semester. All but one student agreed to participate. So I had 10 research mini proposal reflections and 10 reflective. I used directive coding because I drew from assessment codes that were developed for 3010 as initial kind of framework for reading through the portfolios and the mini reflection, and then as the data began to become more apparent to me, I changed those or deleted or added, depending on what I was finding in the text. And I used Deduce, which is a web-based application allowing me to statistically analyze, well, I wouldn't say statistically, but at least count and code the information. All right, so this is really small, so I'm just going to pass this out for you. These are the, I'll just start over here. I think I don't know, but I'm just going to start pictures. So, oh, sorry. So the large codes that I came up with, and these have subcodes. So the parent codes were, I found that students talked about genre as a concept. This means that they had an understanding of genre as being some kind of concept. And there's a textual example from students on the third column. Or they recognize this particular genre. So they might have said project 3 asked me to write a research proposal. Or they described a particular genre, and in this way they told me some key features of this genre. Or they analyzed the features, so this is where they dug a little bit deeper and kind of analyzed why genres work a certain way or why they're structured a certain way. And then another component that because my class is so focused on revision as well, is that a lot of students talked quite heavily about how they revised. So their research proposal has 6 steps. Those steps allow them to continuously build upon their writing. So, and I provide continuous feedback to them, and so they're constantly in the mode of finding additional sources, revising their research proposal, adding on to it, and so this understandably was a component to their responses. And then within those parent codes I found continuously discussions throughout those parent codes of their discussion of the structure of genre. So they recognize, describe, analyze, or talk about revision of a genre structure. So for example, they might say the genre structure of a literature review must mirror the introduction and provide background information with many sources in it to be correct. So they're talking about how they are being asked to structure this research proposal. Or they talked about the very specific features, right? So they might talk about how the introduction had to match our meta-genre of the course, and there's a template that they're supposed to follow. And so they talk about what conventions must be in that introduction. Or they talk about the social aspects where they describe, analyze, or revise for social features. So they might say, I now know that genres are always meshed and used to communicate ideas and research to other members within a particular discourse community. So they're talking about genres as being socially active rather than just being a structure or a convention. Or they talk about audience, how they had to change their tone of voice, or how they had to change their writing, or how they had to research in a particular way so that it made sense for their discourse community, the people they were trying to reach. So for Project 3, the reflections, their discussion of genre recognized, revised, analyzed, and as a concept were very low. But the highest total was genre recognized, which is not surprising, simply because at this point, I think they're still trying to understand the genre that they're writing in. They're still trying to understand how they use it, why they're using it. Their second highest component was revised, because this makes sense as well, because I'm constantly asking them to revise. Let's go a little bit deeper, let's go a little bit further here. But in their I think I'm missing a slide. Okay, sorry, I am missing a slide in here somehow. So in their reflective portfolios, however, there were 314 instances of genre analyzed, revised, recognized, and described. And so you'll see that genre analyzed previously was the third most frequent, and this has now become the highest. So they are now beginning to tell or start to contemplate or reflect upon why genres do certain things, why they did certain moves in their writing, and then similar to the mini reflection, they talk about revision second as the second highest frequency. And so the percentage of excerpts from student writing that reflected analysis, revision, recognition, or description of genre was substantial, and additionally, that moved from a lower level of types of reflective moments to a much higher moment of reflective moments. So, as we see, the highest frequency of genre awareness was genre recognized, as I said, whereas in the portfolio it was genre analyzed. All right, so discussions of findings. I just wanted to pull out the highest number, which was genre analyzed, which was 123. And so you'll see in there the child codes where when they did analyze genre, the highest frequency was conventions, then structure, then social, then audience, and then analysis. So even though they are analyzing, they're still analyzing conventions and structure and privileging that over the social or the audience or analysis of a genre. So while this seems exciting, and I think that it is exciting, this is still indicating that students are very much holding on to kind of what they know. They're trying to hold on to concepts of, for instance, they might talk about structure and talk about how APA asked them to write in an IMRD format, right? Rather than talking more about why would my discipline of the medical profession ask that I write in an APA format, right? So while there are moments of that, unfortunately, they privilege the conventions and structures over that more meta reflection that I would like to see in students' writing. And if you'd like to see some student examples of the genre analyzed with those subcategories, there's a table for that as well. So what does this mean? The findings suggest that students do demonstrate genre awareness in the reflective writing. So this is something that I think, and of course this is a small data set, this is one class, so this is certainly not amazing findings, but they do at least show that students are demonstrating genre awareness, and that they are responding to a genre-based pedagogy in a 3010 course. The findings do suggest that reflection, when used in stages, does develop students' growth of genre awareness, where they're reflecting on their prior, current, and future learning. However, as I said, the child code analysis does indicate that genre awareness is still building, and that they place the most focus on structure and conventions of the genres rather than the social components of the genres. So what might be interesting to see is what might need to occur with this is that while students are writing and trying to acquire and write in new genres, asking them to talk about, write about, and think about more of the social components of genres, or making that more present. And so while it was my assumption that I did do that in class, and we did talk about that, and we do see instances of that, it appears that that might be something that needs to be reiterated more frequently when students are trying to acquire a new genre, because it's understandable for them to kind of glom onto the most easiest components of a new genre rather than the very multifaceted aspects of that genre.
So my contribution is a little bit different. I'm going to come at reflection from a theoretical perspective and try to think about how reflection might contribute to developing agency. So I want to start with, I think, this quote I have on the screen. The body has to learn to play itself like a musical instrument in this world's compositions. And I think in my work with literacy and writing, I think a lot about practice and what does it mean to continually practice something over time. Yeah. And one thing what I want to talk about today is how we might think about reflection as a way of playing the body in these sort of mind-body cultural interactions that happen in the classroom, and I think like what are the sort of, you know, what might be I think we're all sort of interested in understanding what are the consequences of doing reflection for students. Does it lead to the kind of positive transfer that Abe was talking about, the flexibility, or, you know, with Thomas's contribution too, how does changing the subject stem of a sentence open up new affordances for student thinking and learning and growth? So I want to sort of frame these as issues of agency. So in my research, I use a term I call discursive readiness potential to describe the kind of literacy muscle memory that ensues from the repeated reiteration of language practices as meaning making sort of happens in these mind-body networks that we live through and act in. Discursive readiness potential situates agency as an everyday function of embodied actors, and it comes from our prior experience as much as from the unfolding situations at hand. And it marks agency as the process of navigating the array of potential actions we could take. Reflection, I want to argue, constitutes an important feedback loop between performance, memory, learning, and classrooms, and as such represents a critical instrument that we play as we sort of learn to play our bodies as we grow. Represents a critical instrument in composing students' capacities to act in the social and discursive situations that happen in the classroom and beyond. So the kinds of questions I'm interested in exploring include the following. How does reflection intervene in the narrowing down of an array of possible actions? This is a question of agency cast as a process of narrowing down. When we look at it at the smallest level, but you know, certainly writing situations are more complex than just like one actualization. But put another way, I'm asking, how does experience inform the composition of agency to the practice of practice, and how does reflection intervene in that process? So first, so I just want to touch on a couple of concepts and then try to tie that to reflection. The first, I want to think about agency as maneuvering or navigating, rather than agency as like a kind of intentionality. And in Agency and the Death of the Author, compositionist John Trimble articulates a notion of agency that contrasts with concepts of agency as mastery and control. Trimble writes, agency is not about explaining, but it's about maneuvering, not the theory, but the practice of practice. It's the doing of these reading and writing practices over time and navigating and is the capacity to navigate different practices in real time. Following several composition scholars who take up the cognitive sciences in order to better understand the mind-body dynamics of writing, I understand writing and discursive agency as simultaneous issues of the mind, body, and culture in the material world. As Marilyn Cooper explains, writing is an embodied activity situated in environments replete with tools, technologies, and other bodies. And the practices that are writing emerge as people respond to others and to their world. They are not the products of minds somehow separated from bodies, nor of innate technical or linguistic abilities. To understand writing from this biological and cultural perspective requires us to account for the ways writing activities are inexorably tied to complex networks of our bodies and other bodies, tools and non-human actors. Words and tools are ready-at-hand parts of our brain-body-world networks, and writing is always in emergent interaction with our surrounds. So how we write in terms of discourse moves and body moves shifts as we move from one writing ecology to another. So for example, if we think about the kinds of body moves and thinking moves, discourse moves that happens when we do journal writing in a public space versus word processing in a home office, or jotting notes or on a tablet in a meeting, maybe like this one. The kinds of discourse actions that are available to you that emerge as potentials vary from one scene to scene, and how you do the writing materially changes as well. So I'm thinking here of writing and agency as this material cognitive practice. And to start to push towards reflection, that I want to talk a little bit about agency from two scholars that I draw on. The first agency, this first concept, agency, is free won't, and then I'll talk about agency as a library of I can'ts. So first, I'm going to draw from cognitive psychologist Schwartz and Bagley's work on neuroplasticity, or the brain's capacity to rewire itself. So Schwartz did this research with OCD patients. He was interested in understanding how do we come to be able to change these deeply ingrained habits of doing. So what he found from doing brain scans was that there was a circuit in the brain that would get activated when patients felt compelled to go do something, like wash their hands, whatever the OCD behavior was. And he developed a treatment that involved first, with like full mental awareness, thinking about alternative actions. And so it was very theoretical at first, very conceptual, thinking like I could go garden or do something more productive than washing your hands over. And gradually, through this practice of directing mental effort at the problems, the patients eventually being like that, the theory that it's only potentiality would become actualized. They could go garden instead of washing their hands. And so what he found was that there was a material change in the brain, and found this through brain scans before and after treatment. And so what he argues is that we should think of agency here as a free won't. It's a capacity to narrow down, to choose, not necessarily choose what to do, but choose what I'm not going to do. And in this case, it takes some time and mental effort to develop this ability for a potentiality to become an actuality. So agency is like, in this way, Schwartz and Bagley's work, I think, echoes Trimble's idea that agency is a way of maneuvering, and it's a way of maneuvering, and for Schwartz and Bagley, the maneuvering is, channeling. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do this other thing instead. So for Schwartz and Bagley, agency exists not to initiate or invent action, but to narrow the field of potential actions by allowing and suppressing possible alternative actions. Schwartz and Bagley explain the prefrontal cortex, which is the brain region most directly tied to conscious cognitive thought, plays a central role in the seemingly free selection of behaviors, choosing from a number of possible actions by inhibiting all but one and focusing attention on the chosen one. The power of agency lies in narrowing the field of potentiality, and if we want to affect change on an individual's capacity to act, we must work to strengthen the likelihood that a possible action will happen. This is the site for reflection to intervene, and agency is a refusal to complete an action initiated by one's non-conscious brain activity, a process that, like I said, they call free won't, or the mind's veto power over brain-generated urges. Long-standing habitual actions enjoy strong neural networks that reinforce the likelihood that we will continue to do those actions. Schwartz and Bagley's concept of mental force allows us to articulate how writers can initiate a free will agency through the practice of practice, which can begin by just conceptualizing alternative actions, thereby composing new potentials for actions in future situations. The next piece I want to draw on, the French scholar Carrie Noland, she builds on Schwartz and Bagley's treatment of agency in her work on cultural gestures from the lenses of cognitive science and the humanities in her book, Agency and Embodiment. For Noland, the material body consists of emergent potentials for action that may be enacted to create culture. And by activating or performing various gestures as culturally meaningful assemblages, we are writing the body as the body writes. And this connects with Schwartz and Bagley, and what they find is that by writing, by composing new possible actions, not only does the person go tend the garden, but they're composing material changes in their body and their body-brain networks. Noland explains, like any element of a conventionalized language, gestures are iterable. but when performed by me, they are not necessarily iterations. There's a first time for they are not necessarily iterations. There's a first time for my body to perform what other bodies already have learned to do, and there's a first time for my body to perform the gesture in an idiosyncratic and potentially subversive way. Reiterating gestures or assemblages of culturally meaningful language practices forges for the actor a library of I-cans, which are materially sedimented in neural circuits that enhance or hamper the likelihood of actions materializing and happening. Having a library of I-cans provides us the flexibility we need to respond to dynamic discursive situations in novel, unpredictable ways, without some capacity to develop self-aware feedback of our iterations. We will quickly be hemmed in by the library of I-cans and the concomitant sets of neural circuits that mediate thought and action. So, I think what this suggests for me is that we think of, the kind of reflection and transfer of learning here as problems of agency. How do students, do reflection? Or some set of, it represents a set of self-aware feedback or mental force that's critical for actors to intervene in and to cultivate a range of readiness potentials, libraries of culturally meaningful actions or I-cans. And what's critical though, what I've learned from this, what's important is that we have to think of it as something that happens over time. It's a practice of practices. And it's only through that practice of practice, through the pattern, through the trend over time, that these actions can happen, the changes can happen. So for example, in my writing classes, I ask the students to do a lot of reflecting, and that reflection happens around major assignments, and it happens in the lead up to assignments. And what I think my goal is that by asking students to think about things like, what struggles did you face, and so it's to become aware of what the problem is, and what are you doing to, what were the actions that you took, and what was the consequence of those actions, and then what would you do the next time? Start to be aware and think about not just the writing, but like everything else that's happened around the writing. My hope is that over a course of semester, this habit of being aware of what, the actions, the discourse actions that I'm doing, and being aware of them in the moment of working on a complex writing project, my hope is that will lead into the future new, building a library of I-cans, developing new possible actions. But, so I think that in that way it sort of echoes, I think, what the panel is interested in. Thinking about reflection as a tool, not only for understanding the success of learning in a curriculum, but leading to material change for students and how they use language and writing.
Nice. I think we have a couple minutes for a question or a comment. Grievance? Corey.
Mr. Thomas,
Sir.
my question is for you.
Yes.
When in the course of the semester project sequence in 1020, you kind of see this generative STEM kind of maybe taking place, like the end, like project 5, or is it like starting at project 2, 3? Kind of how would you kind of build that in?
I think it could happen right away.
Right away.
I could think right away. So imagine project 1 early in the semester, some sort of post-project reflection. How do you think things went? Students could write a reflection, like some sort of reflective letter. Hey, things went well. I did this, I did this, I did this. And then come back with some feedback and say, all right, well, let's try and approach that again. Here's some steps. What do you now know about research that you didn't know before? What do you know about your own writing process that you didn't know before?
Right.
So I would suggest, I think we should start right from the get-go. What do you think?
So you see the stems coming out, let them write first, and then bring the stems back in, have them almost like a revision of their.
I would first
reflection.
introduce it as a feedback revision tool, and then we could go from there. Then you could see maybe later in the semester you could start off with a reflective draft, starting with stems during drafting. But I think my first hunch would be to use it as a revision feedback tool. I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
question for Adrian. So you're interested in tracking students' references to affect or emotions in their reflections. I was just curious, do you worry about the possible problem where a student's use of that kind of language might elevate their score or inflate their score, in the sense that it's difficult when doing, for assessment purposes anyway, reading that kind of material, you tend to maybe favor students who seem to have the authentic experience of having overcome a struggle, and there's at least a problem of teacher pleasing taking place across the entire spectrum.
Sure. Well, so I have a two-part answer. One, my interest in looking at those moments, I think it's tricky to look at them in the reflective argument essay and say, how would I work with them then? Because it's the end of the semester. So I kind of extrapolated from that to think, how would I use these moments earlier in the semester? But in terms of assessment and working on it and being concerned about inflation of a score or something based on that moment, I think when we are trained in assessment to look for evidence in the content, then the teacher-pleasing moments they just kind of, or I'm callous, but no, they just like wash over me. I don't pay attention to them because I'm looking for I'm looking for different moves when their goal is to support their work on course learning outcomes. Someone can be very impassioned, or they can do that like, my whole life was changed because of English 1020, and they could have the most enchanting paragraph about the struggle of writing their rhetorical analysis essay. But if they don't actually do the moves where they're giving us evidence of their flexible writing process or how they incorporated research in a particular assignment, then those other moves those emotion moves don't make a difference. To a calloused, experienced assessment reader like myself. Yeah.
Thank you. Ellen.
Yes, I'll go 1, 2, 3, a question for Jill. I noticed that in table 1, you have a code genres concept, and that got three total in reflective essays, and it doesn't appear at all in the reflective portfolio.
No.
So there were no instances, right?
No, so the genre as a concept, like this just general, like, I recognized genres or became much more, they were able to just describe it in more detail. And so they didn't so genre as a concept, when I coded it, was just kind of this weird, kind of like, I know genres exist, right? But
Because, well, I'm wondering about, what your implications, saying that, and by the way, I would regard it as very positive that English 3010 students are now able to do quite a bit with genre structure and genre conventions. I wonder if that is somehow part of the notion of genre as social action, conceptualization.
Right.
I wonder if those, if this genre as a concept is
then being
well, do you have any category that looks at genre conceptualization? I guess it just worries me that there's not a code that will encompass something along the lines of genre as social action, which I know is part of your pedagogy.
Right. Well, within like the subcodes, for each of these genre analyzed, revised, recognized, and described, there is a code of genre as a social act.
Okay.
And so that's where those get reinterpreted into. So
I think it's interesting that it's not one of the overall codes. I think you need a social code is what I'm saying.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so too. This is, and I will let everyone know this is initial research that I'm conducting for my dissertation. So there's still, I think, a bit of work to be done on this, but this is what I've initially found thus far. So
Yes.
As I heard all of you talk, the reflection I had was that this reminded me very much of like cognitive behavioral therapy. It is if it's cognitive behavioral learning. And I wonder if that is kind of like, in a way, kind of like your model here. You're talking about cognition and you're talking about getting students to reflect. And I know in cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea is to get the patient to reflect on what they're doing and then look at their behavior. And I kind of wonder, in a way, you're trying to do this in a learning context. Am I turning in correctly here?
I think in some ways when we're asking students to reflect while they're working on a writing project, we're asking them to tune in some ways. I mean, Clay's talking about some of the more, I'm going to interpret it wrong, but like some of the physical moves or where we place ourselves when we're writing, and how some of those decisions might come into play. Some of us are thinking about other rhetorical decisions that students are making during the process. I don't draw from that body of research when I write about reflection, but I do think about how explicitly prompting students to think about their choices can impact not just this one instance of a writing decision, but potentially future instances. Not that I want them to constantly make that same decision, but I want them to always be ready to think about the decision that they're making. I don't know if that helps a little bit, but.
Yeah, I think, I don't know what I have to add, but I was thinking about how I'll ask students to become aware of themselves writing in as much of a holistic sense as they can, and then to think, and for me I think of it as like, I want them to think critically about how are they doing writing in terms of like, where are they doing it, what are they using, what kinds of tools are they using to do the writing, and then to assess to the best they can what's effective or not effective about that, and sometimes that thinking process is augmented by what we'll read in the class, material that might talk about writing from a meta perspective, and I'll invite them to try and apply some of that. But I'm not sure. I don't, if that connects with how that connects with cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate it.